I never imagined that the sound of elevator doors closing would become the soundtrack to my destruction. But there I was, standing in the marble lobby of what used to be my penthouse building, watching those polished steel doors seal shut on everything I had ever called mine. The woman beside my husband, my former husband, couldn't have been more than her perfectly manicured fingers traced the buttons as if she owned the place, and in that moment, the bitter truth crystallized. She did own it now. They both did, but let me start from the beginning, because every story of revenge needs context, and mine, well, mine is a masterpiece of calculated destruction that took me 3 years to orchestrate. If you're here for this journey, do me a favor and hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel, because what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you think you know about family, loyalty, and the lengths a woman will go to when she's been stripped of everything she ever believed was hers. 20-7 years ago, I married into the Whitmore family thinking I was climbing a ladder to paradise. Richard Whitmore III, handsome, wealthy, with that easy charm that comes from never having wanted for anything. I was 32, beautiful in that fresh-faced way that money can maintain, and I believed I had won the lottery. The wedding was featured in Town & Country magazine, 500 guests at the country club, flowers flown in from Holland, a dress that costs more than most people's cars. I felt like a queen. The penthouse came 3 years later, after Richard's father died and left him controlling interest in the pharmaceutical company. 42nd floor, panoramic views of the city, marble everywhere you looked. 3,000 square feet of what I thought was security. I decorated every room myself. Spent months choosing the perfect shade of cream for the living room walls, importing Italian leather for the furniture. I remember standing on that wraparound terrace, looking out over the city lights, feeling like I owned the world. Those early years, I threw dinner parties that were legendary in our circle. Politicians, celebrities, old money families who had been running this city for generations. I learned to speak their language, the subtle art of the backhanded compliment, the way to make someone feel excluded without saying a word, the importance of being seen at the right charity galas with the right people. I thought I was playing the game perfectly. But here's what I didn't understand then. I was never really a player. I was just a beautiful prop in someone else's performance. Richard's mother, Eleanor, made that clear from the beginning. She had this way of looking at me like I was slightly out of focus, like if she blinked hard enough, I might disappear and be replaced by someone more, suitable. Someone whose family had been in the society pages for more than one generation. Someone whose blood was as blue as their trust fund. The worst part was how subtle it all was. Never a direct insult, never an outright dismissal, just a constant stream of small corrections, gentle suggestions, meaningful looks exchanged with other family members when I spoke. When I mentioned wanting to redecorate the library, Eleanor would smile and say, "Oh, how refreshing to hear such modern ideas." When I wore a dress she deemed too colorful, she'd compliment me by saying, "You're so brave with your choices, dear." I endured it because I thought it was temporary. I thought eventually I'd prove myself worthy of their acceptance. I had their son, after all. Surely that counted for something. When Sarah was born, I was certain everything would change. I was giving them an heir, continuing their precious bloodline. But even motherhood couldn't elevate my status in their eyes. If anything, it made me more invisible. Now I was just the vessel that had delivered what they really wanted. A grandchild to mold in their image. Sarah grew up in their world more than mine. Private schools where tuition cost more than most people's salaries. Summer camps in Switzerland, riding lessons, piano lessons, French tutors. By the time she was 12, she spoke with the same subtle condescension I'd learned to recognize in her father's family. She'd correct my pronunciation of foreign words, suggest I might want to read certain books to improve my understanding of culture. She was becoming one of them, and I was still the outsider looking in. Richard and I lived like roommates, sharing an expensive hotel. He had his business dinners, his golf weekends, his mysterious late nights at the office. I had my charity committees, my personal trainer, my standing appointment at the salon every Tuesday. We moved through our beautiful life like actors playing roles we'd memorized but never quite believed in. The sex stopped being about connection years before it stopped altogether. It became another performance. Another way to maintain the illusion that we were a successful couple living a successful life. I should have seen it coming. The signs were there, the way he started working later. The new attention to his appearance. The sudden interest in weekend business trips to cities I'd never heard him mention before. But I was so focused on maintaining my position, so terrified of losing what little status I'd managed to acquire, that I ignored what was happening right in front of me. The pharmaceutical company had been struggling for years, though they'd done an excellent job of hiding it from the outside world. Richard's father had made some catastrophic investments in the early 2000s, betting everything on research that never panned out. By the time Richard inherited control, they were hemorrhaging money faster than they could borrow it, but we kept living like nothing had changed. The penthouse, the country house, the cars, the vacations, all of it financed by debt that was growing like cancer. When the crash came, it was swift and total. The FDA rejected their major drug application, 10 years and $200 million down the drain. The board of directors called for Richard's resignation. Creditors started circling like vultures. Within 6 months, everything was gone. The company, the country house, the cars, even the penthouse, all of it seized by banks and lawyers. And people I'd never heard of who apparently owned pieces of our life I didn't even know existed. But here's the part that still burns in my chest like acid. Richard had been planning his escape for months, while I was still buying fresh flowers for the penthouse every week, still making dinner reservations at our usual places. He was moving money into accounts I didn't know about, transferring assets into names I'd never seen. He had lawyers I'd never met drawing up papers that would protect him, while leaving me with nothing. The woman's name was Diana, and she was everything I used to be, 20 years younger, blonde, ambitious, working as a junior executive at one of the companies Richard had been negotiating with during the final months. She had that hungry look I recognized from my own mirror decades earlier, the look of someone who thought she was about to win. Everything. The final insult came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was in the penthouse, surrounded by boxers, trying to figure out what I was allowed to take and what belonged to the creditors. The doorman called up to tell me that Mr. Whitmore was coming up with a guest. I assumed it was his lawyer, maybe someone from the bank. I put on my best dress, the navy one Eleanor had always complimented, and tried to compose myself for whatever humiliation was coming next. But it wasn't a lawyer. It was Diana, carrying an overnight bag and looking around my home like she was already planning where to put her furniture. Richard had that sheepish look men get when they're about to destroy everything but want you to think it's somehow for your own good. "Jennifer," he said, and I could tell from his tone that he'd practiced this speech. "Diana and we need to talk." They were taking the penthouse. Not just taking it, they had already taken it, bought it from the bank at a private auction I didn't even know was happening. While I was packing my life into cardboard boxes, they were signing papers that made my home theirs. The marble I'd chosen, the kitchen I'd designed, the terrace where I'd hosted parties that made us the envy of everyone we knew. All of it was theirs now. "I hope you understand," Diana said, and her voice had that bright, fake sincerity that only comes from someone who's never had to understand anything difficult in their life. "It's just business." The bank needed to sell quickly, and we were in a position to make an offer. I remember staring at her, this young woman wearing a dress that costs more than some people's rent, standing in my living room like she belonged there, like I was the intruder, like I was the one who needed to explain myself. That night, I stayed in a hotel, not a nice hotel. I couldn't afford a nice hotel anymore. A place downtown where the walls were thin and the carpet smelled like cigarettes and broken dreams. I lay on that polyester bedspread, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, and I made a decision that would consume the next 3 years of my life. I was going to destroy them both. But first, I needed to understand exactly how much I'd lost, and more importantly, how much Sarah stood to inherit, because that's when I discovered the most crushing betrayal of all. My daughter had known, not just known, but participated. While I was being systematically stripped of everything I'd built, Sarah had been working with her father's lawyers to ensure that whatever remained of the family money would flow directly to her, bypassing me entirely. The trust fund that Richard's father had established, the one I'd assumed would provide for me in my old age, had been restructured years earlier. Sarah was now the primary beneficiary of everything: the insurance policies, the remaining investments, even a small property in Vermont I'd never heard of. She was 25 years old and about to inherit more money than I'd ever seen. While I was facing bankruptcy and homelessness, when I confronted her about it, she looked at me with those cold blue eyes she'd inherited from her father's side of the family. And she said something I'll never forget. "Mother, you never really understood how this world works, did you? Money goes to the people who know how to keep it. That's not you." Standing in that hotel room, with my entire life reduced to 3 suitcases and a checking account that wouldn't last 2 months, I realized I'd been playing a game where everyone else knew the rules except me. But now I understood something they didn't. I had nothing left to lose. which made me infinitely more dangerous than they could imagine. I want to pause here for a moment. If you're watching this video, I know you understand what it feels like to be underestimated. To have people assume you're not smart enough or strong enough to fight back. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, your city, your country. Let me know I'm not alone in this feeling. Because what I'm about to tell you required me to become someone I never thought I could be. The first thing I did was hire investigators. Not the kind you see in movies, real ones, former FBI agents who specialized in financial crimes. It cost me my last $5,000. But I needed to understand exactly how Richard had managed to hide assets while claiming bankruptcy. I needed to know where the money had really gone, and more importantly, how much of it had been moved illegally. What they found was breathtaking in its scope and complexity. Richard hadn't just hidden money, he'd created an entire shadow financial structure, designed to make himself appear poor while keeping millions of dollars accessible through offshore accounts and shell companies. The pharmaceutical company bankruptcy, mostly theater. The real assets had been moved years earlier into a network of holding companies and trusts that would make Al Capone proud. But here's what made it criminal, rather than just unethical. He'd done it while still married to me, using community property laws that meant half of everything should have been mine. Every dollar he'd moved, every asset he'd hidden, represented theft on a massive scale. Not just from me, but from the creditors, the employees who'd lost their jobs, the shareholders who'd been left with worthless stock. The investigators gave me a folder 3 inches thick, full of financial records, bank statements, and evidence of transactions that violated at least a dozen federal laws. But they also gave me something more valuable: the names of the people who'd helped him do it. Lawyers, accountants, financial advisors, a whole network of professionals who'd participated in what amounted to organized fraud. That's when I learned something interesting about very wealthy people. They're only as powerful as their secrets are safe. And Richard's secrets were about to become very, very public. I started with the lawyers. The ones who'd helped structure the offshore accounts were bound by attorney-client privilege, but they weren't immune to having their reputations destroyed. I began making calls to their other clients, asking innocent questions about whether they'd ever noticed anything unusual about their legal representation. I sent anonymous letters to the State Bar Association, detailing suspicious transactions and questionable practices. The accountants were easier. I'd kept copies of our tax returns going back 15 years, and with the help of my investigators, I could show a clear pattern of fraud and misrepresentation. The IRS loves getting tips about wealthy people who think they're too smart to get caught. I became their new best friend. But the real masterstroke was Diana. Sweet, innocent Diana, who thought she'd won the lottery by stealing another woman's husband. She had no idea that every penny Richard was spending on her, the jewelry, the vacations, the private shopping trips, was stolen money that could be traced and recovered. I began documenting everything: every restaurant they visited, every gift he bought her, every weekend trip they took. I hired photographers to follow them, not for the emotional satisfaction of seeing them together, but to create evidence of how stolen marital assets were being used to finance their relationship. The legal battle began 15 months after I'd been evicted from my own home. I filed suit against Richard for fraud, against the lawyers for malpractice, against the accountants for negligence, and against Diana for receiving stolen property. I sued the bank that had sold them the penthouse for failing to properly notify me of the auction. I sued the pharmaceutical company for hiding assets during bankruptcy proceedings. The first court date was in September, on one of those crisp autumn days that make you remember why you fell in love with the city in the first place. I wore my best suit, not designer anymore. I couldn't afford designer anymore, but clean and pressed, and professional. Richard showed up with 3 lawyers and the kind of confidence that comes from never having faced real consequences for anything. The judge was an older woman, maybe 6, with silver hair and the no-nonsense demeanor that comes from spending decades listening to wealthy people explain why they shouldn't be held accountable for their actions. She listened to the opening statements with the kind of patience that suggested she'd heard all of this before. Richard's lawyers argued that I was a bitter ex-wife trying to relitigate a divorce settlement, that the financial arrangements had been legitimate business decisions made during a difficult time. They painted me as vindictive, unstable, someone who couldn't accept that her marriage was over and was now trying to use the courts for revenge. My lawyer, a woman named Patricia Chen, who specialized in recovering assets from fraudulent transfers, laid out the evidence like she was building a house. Foundation first, the pattern of hidden assets and secret accounts, then the walls, the specific transactions that violated community property laws. Finally, the roof. The criminal conspiracy that had involved multiple professionals who should have known better. The first phase of the trial lasted 6 weeks. Every day, I sat in that courtroom listening to my life being dissected by lawyers who charged more per hour than I used to spend on shoes. But slowly, incrementally, the truth began to emerge. Bank records that couldn't be explained. Transactions that made no legitimate business sense. Patterns of behavior that could only be understood as systematic fraud. The most damaging testimony came from Richard's own business partners, men who'd been subpoenaed to explain their role in the asset transfers. Under oath, facing potential criminal charges themselves, they began to crack. One by one, they admitted to helping Richard hide money, to creating false documentation, to participating in what they now realized was a massive fraud scheme. By Christmas, Richard's confidence had evaporated. The man who'd walked into that first hearing flanked by expensive lawyers was now pale and nervous, whispering urgently with attorneys who were clearly advising him to settle. The investigation had expanded beyond my civil suit. The FBI was now involved, looking into possible federal charges for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. But I wasn't done. Not even close. Sarah had been subpoenaed to testify about her knowledge of the trust fund restructuring, about her conversations with her father's lawyers, about her role in what was looking more and more like a criminal conspiracy. When she took the stand in January, she looked smaller somehow, less sure of herself than I'd ever seen her. Under cross-examination, my own daughter admitted that she'd known for years about her father's hidden assets. She'd attended meetings with lawyers where they discussed how to restructure family finances to avoid potential liabilities, meaning me. She'd signed documents transferring money into her name, knowing that her father was claiming poverty in divorce proceedings. "Did you ever consider," Patricia asked her, "that your mother might have a legal right to those assets?" Sarah's answer will haunt me until the day I die. I didn't think she'd earned them. Earned them. As if 27 years of marriage, of raising their child, of supporting Richard's career and maintaining their social position, of enduring the subtle cruelties of his family, as if none of that had earned me anything at all. The settlement negotiations began in March. Richard's lawyers, now facing the possibility that their client might spend the next decade in federal prison, were suddenly very interested in resolving things quietly. The government had frozen most of the hidden assets, and there was talk of criminal charges that could result in serious jail time. They offered me $2 million and a formal apology. I countered with $8 million in admission of wrongdoing. They came back with $4 million and a non-disclosure agreement. I told them to go to hell, because by then I understood something that had taken me 55 years to learn. Some things are worth more than money. Some victories are worth more than financial security. Some battles are worth fighting even when you know they'll destroy everything you touch, including yourself. The final hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in May. The government had decided to file criminal charges against Richard for wire fraud and money laundering. Diana was facing charges for receiving stolen property. Every gift, every vacation, every night she'd spent in my penthouse was evidence of a crime. Sarah was being investigated for tax evasion and conspiracy. The night before the hearing, Richard called me. It was the first time we'd spoken directly in almost 2 years, and his voice sounded smaller than I remembered. Older. "Jennifer," he said, "we need to end this. It's destroying everyone." "Good," I told him. That was the point. Sarah is talking about suicide. She's facing criminal charges. Her trust fund is frozen, and she can't get a job anywhere because of the publicity. Our daughter, Jennifer. Think about what you're doing to our daughter. Remember standing in my small apartment, the one-bedroom place downtown where I'd been living since the hotel became too expensive, looking at the newspaper clippings I'd taped to the wall. Every article about the case, every mention of our family's disgrace, every photograph of Richard looking haggard and defeated. She made her choice, I told him. You all made your choices. Now you get to live with the consequences. The courthouse was packed that Thursday morning. The case had attracted attention from financial news outlets, legal blogs, even some mainstream media interested in the story of a wife's revenge against her wealthy husband. I sat in the front row, watching as my former family faced the destruction I'd orchestrated. Richard pled guilty to wire fraud and money laundering. He was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $12 million in restitution, money that would be split between me, the government, and the other victims of his fraud. Diana pled guilty to a lesser charge and received 2 years of probation, but her career in finance was over. Sarah's charges were dropped in exchange for her testimony against her father. but the scandal had made her unemployable in any industry connected to finance or law. I walked out of that courthouse having won everything I'd fought for. The penthouse was mine again, seized by the government as part of Richard's criminal forfeiture and sold to me for back taxes. I had enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life. My ex-husband was going to prison. His mistress was ruined. My daughter would spend years rebuilding a reputation I'd helped destroy. I'd won. Completely. Totally. Devastatingly won. But here's what I didn't anticipate. Victory tastes like ashes when you've had to become a monster to achieve it. I moved back into the penthouse on a Tuesday in October. The same marble floors, the same panoramic views. The same terrace where I'd once entertained the most powerful people in the city. But it felt like a mausoleum, beautiful and cold and full of ghosts. The furniture was gone. Sold or seized or simply disappeared during the legal proceedings. I walked through those empty rooms, listening to the echo of my footsteps. Remembering parties and dinners and conversations that seemed to have happened in another lifetime. The kitchen where I'd planned elaborate meals. The living room where I'd hosted charity fundraisers. The bedroom where my marriage had slowly died, all of it empty now, waiting for me to bring it back to life. But I couldn't. Because the woman who'd loved this place, who'd seen it as the symbol of everything she'd achieved, was gone. She'd been replaced by someone harder, colder, more ruthless than I'd ever imagined I could become. The kind of person who could destroy her own daughter to win a war. The kind of person who could spend 3 years plotting revenge and call it justice. I furnished the place slowly, carefully, trying to recreate the elegance I'd once been so proud of, but everything felt hollow, performative, like I was playing house in someone else's life. When I threw my first dinner party, a small gathering to celebrate my return, the conversation felt forced, the laughter brittle. Everyone wanted to know about the case, about how it felt to win such a spectacular victory over my ex-husband. "You must be so satisfied," one woman said, raising her wineglass in a toast, "to finally get justice after everything they put you through." I smiled and nodded and accepted their congratulations, but all I could think about was Sarah, my daughter, who I hadn't spoken to since the trial ended, who was working as a waitress in another city under a name that wasn't her own. My daughter, who I'd helped destroy because she'd chosen the wrong side in a war that should never have involved her. The loneliness is what gets to you, not the obvious loneliness of having no husband, no family, no close friends that you expect when you wage war on everyone you've ever loved. It's the deeper loneliness of knowing that you've won everything you fought for, and discovered that it wasn't worth fighting for after all. I see Richard sometimes. Now that he's been released from prison, he works at a non-profit downtown, helping former addicts find housing. He looks older, quieter, like the experience changed something fundamental in him. We don't speak, but sometimes our eyes meet across the street or in a coffee shop, and I see something in his face that might be regret, or maybe just exhaustion. Diana moved back to her hometown in Ohio. I heard she got married last year to someone she met at church. Someone who doesn't know about her past. I hope she's happy. I really do. Because holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. And I've had enough poison for one lifetime. Sarah calls me sometimes. Usually late at night. Usually when she's been drinking. She tells me about her job, her small apartment, the community college classes she's taking to try to rebuild her life. She never asks for money, never asks for help, never asks for forgiveness. We just talk, carefully, like strangers who happen to share a history too complicated to explain. "I miss you sometimes," she said during our last conversation. Not the way we were, but the way we could have been, if things had been different. I wanted to tell her that I missed her too, that I'd give anything to undo the choices that had led us to this place. But some words are too dangerous to say out loud, because they might make you realize that everything you've built your life around was a mistake. Instead, I told her I loved her and I hung up the phone. Now I spend my days in this beautiful penthouse, surrounded by expensive furniture and priceless art, with views that still take my breath away. I have everything I fought for, everything I thought I wanted. Financial security, social status. The satisfaction of knowing that everyone who wronged me paid a price for their betrayal. But I eat dinner alone every night. I go to bed alone every night. I wake up alone every morning in this beautiful, empty space that feels more like a monument to my own vengeance than a home. The massage oil. By the way, the detail that started this whole story was eucalyptus oil mixed with capsaicin, something I learned from a chemist friend who owed me a favor. Not dangerous, just memorable. Enough to cause a reaction that required medical attention. Enough to create a scene that would be talked about in our social circle for months. Richard had to explain to paramedics, police officers, and eventually several dozen of our former friends exactly why his mistress was screaming in agony in what used to be my bedroom. It was petty, vindictive, and completely beneath the woman I used to think I was. It was also deeply satisfying in a way that scares me to remember. People ask me sometimes if I regret it. The war, the destruction. The way I systematically dismantled everything and everyone I'd once loved to get revenge for what they'd done to me. They want to know if I think it was worth it, if I'd do it all again. The honest answer is that I don't know. On the days when I'm feeling strong, when the sunlight hits the marble floors just right and the city spreads out below me like a kingdom I've conquered, I tell myself that I had no choice, that they forced me to become someone capable of destroying them, that justice required sacrifice, and I was willing to pay the price. But on the quiet days, when the silence in this penthouse becomes so profound that I can hear my own heartbeat, I wonder if there was another way, if I could have found a path that didn't require me to become someone I barely recognize, if I could have fought for what was mine without destroying what was left of my family. I'll never know, because you can't undo choices like these, can't take back words once they're spoken or actions once they're taken. You can only live with the consequences, in whatever beautiful, empty space you've created for yourself. The truth is, I won everything and lost everything at the same time. I got my revenge, my money, my penthouse, my victory over everyone who'd wronged me, but I also lost my daughter, my marriage, my friendships, and any chance at the kind of peace that comes from forgiveness. Was it worth it? Ask me again in 10 years, when I'm alone in this place with nothing but my memories and my victory to keep me company. Ask me when I'm dying in a hospital bed with no one to hold my hand, no one to mourn me when I'm gone, nothing left but the money I fought so hard to keep and the emptiness I created to protect it. Maybe by then I'll have an answer. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the price of revenge and the cost of victory, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel, because sometimes the most important stories are the ones that don't have happy endings, the ones that show us what happens when we get everything we thought we wanted and discover it wasn't worth the fight after all.